Welcome to our 14th episode of the Water Talks podcast, where water treatment practice, policy, and innovation receive the focus they deserve. I am your host, Els Vanbeckevoort, and I am delighted to be joined by my co-host, Scott Bowron. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, Els. It is nice to see you once again. I missed the last podcast, so good to be back. Summer
Yes,
gets in
sir.
the way of things,
It can.
and I'm really excited today as well to introduce our topic, water wellness safety, and my good friend, Dr. Roy Vore, a senior consultant at Vore and Associates. Don't even know how long I've known you, Roy. So welcome to today's show.
No, thank you. Glad to be
Morning, Roy.
here.
Nice to see you. For our
Yeah.
listeners, Dr. Vore has a Ph.D. in Bacterial Physiology from the University of Arkansas and was a significant contributor and probably still is to the CDC's Model Aquatic Health Code disinfection water quality module. Maybe actually I have a question. I was looking you up yesterday, Roy, and maybe for a guest, what is bacterial physiology? Obviously, it sounds really interesting, and I'm thinking I know what it's about, but could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay, think about it like this. What is the digestive system of a bacteria? How do they eat? What do they make? Do they need this kind of vitamin? Do they need sugar? Do they need protein? How fast do they grow? And just as importantly, how can you control them? So all those things that we go into our, a general practitioner for our annual checkup, and they do all the blood work on you, and they give you all things back, and it's like, yeah, that's what I do with bacteria. So it's just like I put them down there, and I say, oh, you need some vitamin B, so let's get you some vitamin B. So it's like, yeah, so.
Super interesting. It's and very valuable, no doubt, to understand how they function. So that also, as we look at treatment modalities, anyway, we'll get into all of that later. But I just had to ask because it sounded like really exciting and interesting.
Yeah.
And I want to say, Roy, we would say your entire bio, but I think our conversation would be over by the time your history is immense and very well respected. So we're really pleased to see you today. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Els opened it up with the physiology. What do you do? Family history,
Well,
hobby?
I'll start off with one, and you cannot top this story. It's like I'm sure no guest will ever beat this one. I grew up in Kansas. I have a first cousin named Dorothy. The first dog after we got married was a Cairn Terrier, which is also known as a Toto dog. And I have lived through more tornadoes than most people will ever see in their entire life. All right. So, yes. So the movie Twister, where there's a movie Twister where the thing's coming over the top of the hill. And you get that funny feeling in the movie. I get that funny feeling these days when the tornado's about 20 miles away.
Wow.
I can feel them coming. So I don't know what it is. That's not, I'm a bacterial physiologist. I'm not a psychologist or something. But there's something about tornadoes that you grow up in Kansas and you just know when they're around.
Energy. I don't know. That sounds so interesting.
Yeah.
You get attuned to the energy because it must be, it's something amazing, right? It's so large.
Who knows? So it's like, then I went down to the University of Arkansas to do my PhD, and the general description is, well, what did you study? It's like, okay, I studied a bacteria called Zymomonas mobilis, and everybody knows what that is.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Scott, you know what it is. All right, Scott, have you ever heard of the little drink called tequila?
Once I heard about it.
Once you've heard of it. It's actually made by the bacteria called Zymomonas mobilis. So I'm a boy from Kansas with a PhD in tequila.
There you go.
Great combo. I love
it. So then I escaped from Kansas and I started my career at a company called ICI Americas in 1991. And at that time, you basically had four giant chemical companies in the world. You had DuPont, Dow, BASF, and ICI. ICI was basically the DuPont of Europe on there. And they put me in this bacterial control thing. And it was just like, how do you control bacteria in paint and latex? And I was in that for almost 30 days before my career changed.
Wow.
30 days.
And they said, oh, by the way, we have this product over here called Bacquisil, which is used in swimming pools, and we need a microbiologist on it, and you're it. And so it wasn't the job I was hired for, but 30 days in, my career changed, and I ended up developing a model to predict the behavior of swimming pools and spas and hot tubs. And that's how I got started in the business. And it's all those little things about understanding germs, they all paid off. And so I got into it that way and just found out it was fascinating and kept doing it.
You
So you
kind of fell
obviously
into
loved
it.
it. Yeah,
Like
go ahead, Scott.
everybody in the pool business fell into
Oh,
pools. Nobody
totally
started.
fell into it. Fortunately, it was the shallow end in my case, but
Yeah,
mhm.
yeah, very interesting. And so that was 1991, Roy. So what? Obviously, you've developed a deep passion for the thing that
Well,
we do. What's kept you there?
long about 96 or 97, somewhere in there, some questions were coming up about algae and questions were coming up about rashes. And I started looking through the literature. And, at that time, Scott and you and I are both the instructors on here. And you look through the literature on there and it's really generalized. And, uh, basically, all of our training manuals are spoon feeding very simple stories. And so there's no background to it. And you have to go back and you have to start, being a scientific geek. And that's probably a better title for me than doctor. It's just like geek. Um, I started reading and I started reading and I started reading all the stories and where we came from, and the science is not being really explained very well. And I went to, I think it was the Atlantic City Pool Show, somewhere in the early 90s. And all the talks were on water chemistry, scaling, corrosion, channeling, and filters. And there wasn't a single talk on microbiology.
Hmm.
I mean, why are we treating our pools with chlorine? I mean, it was like, so there wasn't a single talk on public health. And I realized right about that point that I could have a career and make a long career out of it if I became a knowledgeable authority on the microbiology of swimming pools. And since 1991, I have been unemployed for 54 hours.
Yeah, that's absolutely understandable. And it's still a need, right? It's still very poorly understood. It's still something that practically speaking, people are wrestling with on a day-to-day basis. Operators are. So I think adding to the body of knowledge and the understanding, so that hopefully we can come up with better treatment modalities and strategies. But I'm sure as we get into more of the practical things later in our conversation, Roy, tell us maybe a few favorite highlights or stories of that long, illustrious career that you've had with the 55 hours of unemployment in between.
Well, I'll start off with the one that terrified me the most, and then I'll tell you the one that proved the most satisfaction. Back before the World Aquatic Health Conference existed, back somewhere in 2003, it was the Aquatic Health Conference, and it was here in Atlanta. And I was still developing my reputation at that point. I was still the geek running around that mostly did algae, and people didn't all know exactly what I did. And this was well before the Model Aquatic Health Code and all that. And so there's like 500 people sitting in the room. And I walk in, and it's like, and Tom Lachaki, who used to head the National Swimming Pool Foundation, had conned me into speaking at this aquatic health conference. So, he goes, Roy, you're a microbiologist, you're going to talk on germs. I said, okay, I can talk on germs, whatever. So I walk in there, and it was just like 500 people. It's like, okay, this is the biggest audience I've ever spoken to. And I walk in, and I look directly over to my left. I'm sitting in the front row. I'm giving a lecture to the CDC on germs.
Oh, fun.
Oh, thank you, Tom, for making me lecture the Centers for Disease Control on germs. It was like, yeah. And it was like I survived that. And when I survived that, I said, well, maybe I actually know something. And for years, I've looked at the numbers. And, we get the numbers back from the CDC about germs and what the outbreaks are and everything like that. Well, most of my work's in residential pools, not in public pools.
Right.
90% of our pools, both, around the world, are residential. And you go into a residential pool and you're talking to the mom or the dad or the kids in there, and they're pulling on their ears, and it's like they're talking about earaches and things like that. And it's like, all right, so I've heard this for 30 some years
Right.
about ear, all right, and that's bacteria. But then we look at the CDC figures and it's like it's all crypto. And, I mean, I've never heard a story about a crypto or a giardia in a residential pool in my 30 some years. Well, my biggest, I think, success in my career has been I have been arguing that Pseudomonas is our number one pathogen for at least 20 years. July last year, the CDC did a disease burden estimate. And instead of using the numbers reported to health departments, they estimated this. And this is the same way they do for all diseases. So they did a different model.
Right.
And guess what? 80% of all infections are earaches.
Yeah.
There are approximately 4.5 million cases of serious earaches a year out of 5.5 million total illnesses. 50% of those are Pseudomonas aeruginosa.
Yeah, so that we have you to thank for that. I don't know, Scott, if you remember, but we talked to Dr. Beach, Michael Beach, about it, and obviously you know each other very well, I presume, Roy. So like that's very exciting that you're able to bring that visibility, because that's incredibly important, right, to understand, both from an ear perspective as well as a skin perspective.
Mm-hmm. And the bottom line there came back is we've really been we've been worrying about crypto.
Right.
And so what we've been arguing about is putting UV or ozone on there when we should have been talking about let's maintain 1 ppm free chlorine at all times in every body of water.
Yeah, I like the article you did for Ph.D, a 2-part article. You just came out, I think, in the last 3 months.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a nice piece, a little different slant to what the norm is of what you normally see. And you did it with some other folks, I think, but it was a newer for our industry. And I think really what you hit, Roy, was 2 things. One is operational, the people who run our commercial swimming pools, and then the other is the population, the people. Right. And those are 2 levels, and we have a long way to go yet. As Al's always says, we have to get this information out and let people know, right? Because they just don't know.
Yeah. Oh, that's incredibly valuable. And, I think that's kind of a nice lead into talking a little bit about the Model Aquatic Health Code and your involvement in that. Like I said to Scott, I actually read the document, and not that I read every tiny little detail with the greatest attention, but I've been going back to it again and again. It's been a great resource. I think it's super valuable. I'm excited to see that in many ways there's lots of alignment between what's happening in the Model Aquatic Health Code and what's happening with regulations in Europe as well. I think there's lots of overlap, and obviously the 2 bodies are talking to each other, because otherwise I wouldn't see so much similarity. And yes, there's maybe some unique perspectives too, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about how can people use this? Like it's such a great document, but I think most of the people that I connect with on the operational side have never read it, never looked at it, don't really know very much what it says. So how can like your involvement in it, how will it evolve into something that can truly inspire some best practices? Like what's your perspective on that, Roy?
First off, I think you need to look at the Model Aquatic Health Code and realize that it consists entirely of 2 separate parts.
Right.
And there's, the code itself is what you must do.
Right.
But, telling somebody you must do this without explaining why is like, some of us have kids and it's like, no, you can't do that. Well, why can't I do that, Dad? Well, the most valuable part of the Model Aquatic Health Code to me is the annex.
I agree.
And that's where, we spent months trying to explain this background science into usable terminology.
Right.
And this is probably the biggest gap that we've got between the hardcore science and our users is getting it into the right jargon. I mean, public health officials speak a different language
Mm.
than most service guys.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And so that annex, when it has that discussion, and this is why you do this is how it happens, that is the real value of the Model Aquatic Health Code. And so if someone was looking for information about pool operation, if they start there, then you go back and you read the code, then suddenly maybe that light bulb goes
It
off.
makes sense. Yeah, no, I can see that for sure. And the educational piece of that is like critical, right? So it's something that you can lecture and talk about and practically connect with people on forever. It's not that, anybody ever knows everything about everything, but I think the educational piece is critically important as well.
Absolutely.
And the evolution, and that it's not a document created in 2014 that's sitting on a shelf
Right.
that is this is it. This is the Bible of aquatics, and now it's getting stale. It's constantly being
Yeah.
challenged, and I know, Roy, you've been in the room when people with very different thinking, and that's good, right? You challenging that philosophy, and that helps us all learn. And the learning is not only for the science, but for the operational, the public at large. You'll be really happy to know I actually had a discussion with a gentleman yesterday from Canada. He called me about a question, and I said, I just had a peek at the Mac on that, and he goes, I actually, I actually referred to the Model Aquatic Health Code before I even called you, and I went, that is gold right there. So it's starting to get out there slowly, but
Mhm.
we're going to be a little behind here in Canada probably in taking
Yeah.
that, picking that document
Yeah.
up.
And making it really practical and useful and accessible, right? Like Roy said,
So
accessible
thank
for
you for
people.
all your work on that, Roy. We all appreciate
Absolutely.
it, and
We sure do.
it's. I know Els told me several times she's read it through, and I go, ooh, that's fun reading.
Well, anyway, I like reading scientific papers. I like reading regulatory documents. I like reading instructions. I think, like I say, it's incredibly valuable and for me, very surprising, but very comforting because I'm also involved with our colleagues in Europe and the Netherlands, where the regulations are the strictest in all of Europe for pools.
Abs-
To understand that, okay, we're all coming at this from a very similar perspective, where health and safety, like we have to do better, and we have to look at sustainability in pools and kind of the whole big picture. But in the first place, it has to be safe. And I think, Roy, that's been your whole life's work. I think trying to kind of get to that point where we can be proactive and preventative and deal differently. Which is maybe my next question. I guess how did you get up into the wellness sector? Because I know you've been everywhere. Obviously helping to discern what the main microbiological problems were in backyard pools or in general. But you also have done a lot of work recently, I guess, in what we call the wellness space. How did you end up there?
Uh, I think it goes back to some of the experiences at the World Aquatic Health Conference about 15 years ago, in there where Tom Lachaki used to bring in cardiologists, and we're bringing in cardiologists, and we're talking about reduction in blood pressure simply by sitting in warm water or even cool water, and you start looking at you sit in any public space and you start realizing that the average population in North America is not physically fit.
Right.
Our diet is a long ways from being perfect. That includes me and includes, I am not physically fit. I am not an athlete. I do work out some, but not nearly enough. So I get lectured every time I go into my doctor.
Yes.
But when we start looking at the benefits of either swimming or simply soaking in a hot tub, or now it's float tanks and cold plunge tanks. And just even passively being in water, the reduction in blood pressure is phenomenal. And you know, heart attacks are still among the top three killers in the
Right.
Western societies. And so here's a venue that can be managed with the things that I do, with the microbiology, that also has the potential for impacting public health overall
In a positive way.
in a very positive way. And so it's that same approach of focusing on health, but maybe in a slightly different manner.
Right.
And it's, you know, maybe it's a little bit of that altruistic nature that I've got buried somewhere in me that it's like maybe I can do a little bit of good for society somewhere by just doing a little bit of education and saying, wait a minute, just stop and get the test strips out when you're in the hotel. Test the spa before you get in it, because spas in a hotel can be really gross. But if the spa is good, soak in it for 15 minutes and your blood pressure will drop down 10 points.
Right. Right.
And Roy, can you just kind of give us an overarching view? We're talking about wellness, the wellness environment, and and I know you're heavily involved now with, I think you said two float associations. I didn't know actually there was two actually active now. I thought there was just the one that, I met you down in Louisville at that last year. What kind of spaces are you talking? Hot plunge, cold float, hot tubs, the whole perspective. What is your realm?
Uh, well, float tanks are a very unusual aquatic venue. For anybody that doesn't know what a float tank is, think of a giant spa, only it's 14 inches deep. And it's got 1,000 pounds of Epsom salts in 140 gallons of water. And the water is so dense that you can't sink. So you lay on your back in this 94-degree water that's not really water, it's salt solution. And you can either do it in the dark or you can do it in the light. You can lift with music. And it's as close to zero gravity as you're ever going to get on the surface of the earth. And now there's huge studies going on sponsored by the National Institutes of Health here in the United States about the psychological impacts of reduction in PTSD, anorexia nervosa, general anxiety disorders. And so Veterans Administration here in the United States has multiple float tanks around various centers. So it's a non-pharmaceutical reduction in anxiety. And in my own case, I had a bike wreck years ago when I dislocated that shoulder. And so I carry all my tension in that shoulder on there. So when I go floating, and that's why it's called floating, I get out of there and that shoulder has zero strain in it for about 10 days. And my blood pressure is about 10 points lower.
Wow.
And so I got invited to go to the first float conference. And Scott, that's where you and I were at, was the float conference is what it's called. In 2018, and I didn't know anything about it. And I started listening to the Ph.D. psychologist in there, and it scared the heck out of me because here I am, a pool boy, talking in there about microbiology. And here is deep psychology terms that I never even heard in grad school. And then I started realizing the non-pharmaceutical benefits of this. And I was getting questions asked by, what's the microbiology of it? And it's such an exotic aquatic environment that you really need a physiologist to study it. And I just happen to be a physiologist. And
That's
so
perfect.
the people were nice. They were asking more questions than we ever see in the pool and spa industry. I mean, they were asking questions about, I'm treating it this way. Is that good enough? What could I do more?
Right.
Should I use a more expensive treatment system? Can I use a better filtrate? It was really the top end question, and they were buying these things that are about the size of a 600-gallon spa, and they were paying $35,000 for them and buying 4 or 5 of them at a time.
Wow. Wow.
And so the attitude of that environment pulled me in, and then I realized these are kind of like-minded people like me that are really focused on health. And so I joined the board of the float conference, and then a year later I joined the Flotation Tank Association board, which I just left last week. So there, but then Scott, you brought up the other one, the new way right now, and we're seeing it in health centers all over the United States and around the world now. It's these cold plunge tanks, and they're basically a refrigerated large bathtub.
Right.
And it's and if you look at the history of it, it's the same thing the Romans did. They had these hot tanks that were about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and they had these 80-degree tanks, and then they had these ice cold tanks, and they would get in one, and they would get in the next, and they would get in the next one. And it would be constricting versus dilating the blood vessels. So it's 2,000-year-old technology, but now we've got these expensive bathtubs. And it was like, okay, so now here's the challenge. Now you've got somebody who's sitting in 104-degree warm water, perspiring like crazy, and they're going to jump directly into a 40-degree cold plunge tank.
All the sweat.
Yeah. And you don't take a shower between them because you want that thermal shock.
Yep.
And so now how are you going to disinfect that? Because you got all that chlorine demand going in there. And so this is going to be a challenge to figure out how to run these things.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And you have to get the people running these places to understand the different water chemistry with the hot water chemistry versus the cold water chemistry, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but is still not very well understood. I think we're still trying to get there.
So Roy, as we're talking about, both the float tank, I guess, and the cold plunge, perhaps maybe you can describe a little bit what's unique about these kinds of pools. So, like, how do they compare, compared to conventional pools in terms of treatment or operation? Maybe you can highlight some of the particular challenges, perhaps, or some of the things that are specific to those kinds of tanks compared to what we normally would see in a swimming pool.
Well, first off, we start off with the easy ones, the float tank. It does not have water in it. It has salt solution. And it is so salty and it is so bitter that no one in their right mind is going to swallow it.
Yes.
I mean, what you do is you take your finger and you touch the surface of the water, the solution, and then you put that on the tip of your tongue, and your mouth will pucker instantly. And what's different, this is a different group of individuals too. You take a shower before you get in and you use soap. All right, Scott, you're laughing, but I mean, there's something like a 99.99% reliance on showers in the float community.
Wow.
So it's like, it's just part of the mentality. So, one, you're taking a shower so you don't have to carry in anything off your backside. Right. 2, you're dealing with an adult population. 3, they know by accident, you'll splash a little bit of the stuff in your eye occasionally. It will burn like crazy. So you're never going to swallow it. All right. So right off the bat, that means Crypto, Giardia, E. coli, Shigella are not a health threat.
Right.
Okay. So then you go, all right, then you could have Legionella, right? Because it likes warm water, except that there's no aerosols in a float tank because it's not running when you're in it. So you never generate an aerosol. And it's got so much salt, Legionella can't grow. So now you've eliminated 2 major categories. But then you've got dermal infections, and that's Pseudomonas aeruginosa. except Pseudomonas aeruginosa is very salt tolerant, and there's too much salt in a float tank if it is well maintained. And so all of the microbiology that we normally worry about in a hot tub or a pool is automatically not a problem in a float tank.
Right.
There have been 2 cases of outbreaks where they did not have the right amount of Epsom salts because it allowed the Pseudomonas to grow. But I ran a major study, over 500 samples for the Flotation Tank Association. And those samples are cleaner than the average well-maintained public pool.
Wow.
And are they using, I mean, they're obviously using filtration, I imagine they are, although that would be challenging.
They are using 3 turnovers between every user. And the worst filters are probably a 5-micron cartridge filter.
Yes.
Those are the worst ones.
Right.
And so that would probably get most of the Giardia out and some of the crypto. But the better ones are actually using a 1-micron bag filter in there. So it's a better efficiency of a filter, and you have 3 complete turnovers between users, which is a much better improved filtration system than we have in any other aquatic venue anywhere
Right.
on the Earth, on the planet Earth.
And
Does
because
that
the
become an
sodium,
industry
yeah,
standard, Roy?
This is the industry standard. This is
yeah,
the industry standard. They will do a 30-minute changeover between users. So there is no immediate transfer. It's like they go in and they clean the room between
right.
users. And so there is this cleaning period where the system runs for 3 turnovers minimum.
Yeah. No, that seems great.
Yeah.
I guess my question was, because of the sodium level or kind of the, the conductivity of this water, you're not really necessarily going to run into biological problems, right? So like filtration, you're talking about ultrafiltration, which 1 micron, that's excellent. So it removes everything physical. You don't necessarily need a biological process then, because you just truly are not seeing any evidence of that building up in the filter system or in the water. Are you
Well,
measuring TOC values? Like, how
well
does that look?
the standard practice for most jurisdictions is to use about 100 ppm hydrogen peroxide,
Yes,
not chlorine.
that's what they do in Europe. Yes, as
Yeah,
well.
there are some jurisdictions like Northern Nevada, state of Florida, where they're using 1 to 4 ppm free chlorine in
Okay.
there. So it, and then some of them are also using UV or ozone on there.
Right.
So there's a variety of technologies are used in there. So, but the primary purpose of all of that is not microbial control; it's
Right.
rather organic control.
Yes, that was my question. So how does, yeah, so they use those things as a complement, if you like, to the filtration system.
Absolutely, in there.
I see.
Now
Okay.
there are a selected number of cases where you will get growth in one of these things, and it's either fungi or yeast
I
because
see.
they're more salt tolerant
Right.
in there. And so it's the same kind of biofilm that it's the same kind of problem that you would see in a spa, for instance, a hot tub.
Yes.
And so generally you pull the cartridge out, and in severe cases, what they've got to do is they've got to drain the float solution out, refill it with tap water, use something like a hot tub purge on it,
Right.
purge it out, and basically you're just sloughing all of that biofilm
Biofilm.
out. You
Right.
flush that down the drain, then you refill
Refill
and
it again.
restart.
I see. Okay. And cold plunges, have you done some study on that yet, or is that still work that's basically having to be completed? Because we do work, Scott, with some other clients who use those in their wellness centers. So I was wondering, did you have any experience in that?
I've had a lot of phone calls recently on that, and the biggest problem that I've seen is that some of the float centers that were using cold plunges, thought they could also use hydrogen peroxide in a cold plunge system. Well, a cold
Yes.
plunge system is really a special purpose swimming pool.
Right.
And going forward, it's going to be classified that under a PHTA guideline. I think
Right.
it's a D5 is what it's going to be called. It's a special, it's swimming pool water. It's just cold. And so hydrogen peroxide is not an appropriate disinfectant for that because at that concentration, hydrogen peroxide will not kill E. coli.
Right.
So, and the biggest problem there is probably going to be Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So you need chlorine in there. And so the problem I've seen from the float community is they're now beginning to realize that. And I lectured them rather sternly at the last float conference.
Yes.
And so, but the question is, how are you able to maintain a cold plunge when you're transferring directly from a hot plunge tank?
Right. Right.
That's
Yeah.
going to be problematic. And we don't have the data on that yet, but it's like you're going to have to almost be testing. If you want to be doing that, you're going to have to be either putting automation on it or you're going to have to be testing manually between users,
Yeah.
every
No,
user.
I can see that because it is such a small body of water, right? So you really need to have that kind of automation control system that's looking at continuously maintaining the water quality and the water chemistry and making sure you're not going to run into problems for sure. I can see that as a serious issue.
No, we have an alternate product in the United States that you do not have in Canada that might be a viable thing, and that is PHMB. That's the polymeric 2,500 molecular weight material. It's been around about 30 years. And that's where I started my business. In business was with that molecule. So it does not respond to chlorine demand, the organic demand like chlorine does. And so it's very efficient in hot tubs, even at high beta load. So
Right.
I've got a couple companies that are looking at using PHMB, a couple
Right.
of the cold plunge manufacturers, but it's not an option in Canada because it's not registered in Canada.
Yeah, no, you need your regulatory registration. I know that in Europe, they also use stabilized hydrogen peroxide in some of those spaces that you've mentioned. So, unlike conventional peroxide, it has a stabilization method, I guess, that allows it to react in unique ways. And we've done a little bit of research and development on that, and have published some papers on it. And it holds some potential promise, I guess, in that way to be able to overcome some of the typical challenges that conventional peroxide has to contend with. But again, there is no registration for it yet in North America, as far as I'm aware. I'm not sure, but again, that's one of those other technologies in Europe that they're using because it has the capacity to build into biofilm a little bit better than conventional peroxide would do
Right,
as well.
right,
So that's
right.
another option. So maybe then, practically speaking, what are some of the challenges that you've heard operators that they like? It sounds like float tanks mostly you've got that looked after now with the work that you've done. Like, are there challenges that they report to you or that you hear about or see in the application?
Well, the biggest issue in float tanks, and it's not an issue, it's really an unknown. All right. In swimming pools, in hot tubs, we encourage them to monitor TDS and change do some water exchange periodically to avoid building of TDS.
Right.
Well, in a float tank, TDS tends to go down instead of up.
Right.
And we have float centers that have run for years and have never changed out their float solution,
Okay. Wow.
but are crystal clear, are odor free, and have no indication of microbial growth or biofilm growth.
Hmm.
So, in a float tank, how often do you have to do a complete fluid change? That's an unknown. And,
Yes.
and I don't know what the marker would be. I
That's the
mean,
value.
yeah, I mean, how do you monitor that? I mean, I think you mentioned earlier, maybe you could do it by TOC, except that now you're going to run something with 300,000 milligrams per liter through an $80,000 TOC machine, and they're not going to like
Not so
that
much.
simple going through their $80,000 machine.
Right, right.
So I don't know that we've got a model that we can predict. So what I'm telling the float center owners is somebody in that shop has got a better nose than anybody else.
Right.
And the human nose, the really sensitive human nose, can pick up that musty, mildewy smell
Yes.
much more efficiently than a microbiologist can by swabbing out the samples.
Yes.
And so odor might be the key to determining the sanitary state for these mold and mildew problems in a float tank.
Right.
And the other one is a color formation, because it's like you start getting biofilm in there, you often see a color formation. So it's aesthetics are really maybe the driver at this point
So
for
the
float
physical
tanks.
parameters rather than the microbiological or chemistry parameters, more the physical ones that you're saying are kind of good indicators.
I think that's the most reliable indications that I know for float centers today.
Okay. Very good. Very
Interesting.
interesting.
I have a quick question for you, Roy, just because not everybody understands these things and people are listening. Float tanks are body temperature or in around there.
You're right.
That's what you go by. What and when you're talking about the limitations on water chemistry, what would define the temperature for what we call a cold plunge pool? Where does that number start?
Start somewhere under 50 degrees Fahrenheit. What's that, about
10.
15 C or somewhere in that
15,
range?
Okay.
14 probably. Just
14
it's just a
C.
quick question.
Down there in somewhere between 4 degrees C and 14 degrees C, depending on the preference. And I've got some centers that will have something like a 30 degree C, a 20 degree C, and a 10 degree C
Right.
tank sitting next to each other.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're they're very popular. They're growing exponentially in our business. Els and I, because that's why I was asking you, when one of the customers dealing with, they put ice cubes in the tub in the morning, right? When people come in, and people pay money to go jump in that cold plunge. So uh, you're a new person. You're starting up. What would be some advice you would give to those folks as they invest in a very expensive business? My apologies.
Well, the first thing is, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to tell anybody that tries to run a cold plunge tank, uh, they need to understand swimming pool and hot tub chemistry.
Right.
The very first thing they need to do is they need to take the CPO course. Now, it doesn't cover the exact material, but it talks about filtration and turnover,
Foundation.
so it gives you a background of it.
Yeah.
And we're beginning to develop as the new material comes out of the CPO courses, we'll have additional material available on there. But they need to understand chlorine chemistry for that, because that's going to be your best bet in the short term, is understanding chlorine chemistry for those kind of environment. And until they understand how a pool operates, they're going to be struggling. And in this particular case, it's going to be in disinfection byproducts. So they probably, if they don't know this kind of chemistry, they need to find a local operator that has dealt with hot tubs, because that's going to be the closest analogy there. And they might have to hire that person as an expert to come in there and say, we need to add more chlorine, or we need to do more ventilation, or we need to do more water exchange at the end of the
Treatment.
day. And there's not going to be a single answer. They may need ozone or UV on those cold plunge tanks. And so it's going to be a trial and error with that design, with that use pattern, with that operator, until they figure out a good design. And we're not there yet.
Right. Yeah, and we see there's a lot of missing pieces as well in terms of having true visibility on the water quality because there's no automation or there's not very well functioning automation and there's a lack of data, right? So like having good data to actually inform potential improvements or changes or having that as kind of a part of that foundation, I think is critically important as well. Like after problems arise, I mean, I guess you've already answered that question, Roy. So after problems arise, again, poor design or lack of understanding, or there's lots of companies springing up all over the map, I guess, that we see here, Scott, that that say they have expertise in this space, but clearly there's significant deficiencies that we see in having that water treatment system properly sized or properly designed. So what can you tell those folks, I guess, that are running into problems and how to kind of fix it or how to get better? You've alluded to it a little bit already, but perhaps you have some additional advice for those that already have inherited this setup, this facility, and now are running into some issues.
I'll make my next statement, and every time I make this statement, I get laughed at, but I'm going to go ahead and make the statement anyway.
Go for it.
I mean, in a situation like this, we don't know exactly what the microbiology is going to be in a cold plunge tank. I don't know whether Pseudomonas is going to be pathogenic at all on there. But when we're thinking about public health in a situation like this, we need to be imagining what could be going on in there. And so the statement that I make is you need to think like a germ.
I like it.
Yeah. And it's like, what am I going to live on?
Right.
What am I going to eat? Where am I going to live? You know, how fast am I going to grow my family? Where am I going to build my house? And so if you envision yourself, instead of, wherever you live, and whether it's in a condo or whether it's in a freestanding home or whether it's in a high rise, you have an environment around you. And you've built this environment around you and you've got a germ does the exact same thing.
Right.
All right. So it's going to build a home somewhere. Where? And it's going to build it's going to build its home in the place that is the most difficult for you as an operator to get to.
Right.
So when you're looking at these systems, can I take them apart and clean them?
Right.
And I run a brush through the line if I've got, I mean, how can I service this system if it's got all these fittings in there and it's got all these 90-degree elbows in there?
Right.
Now we have problems that we can't get to.
Yep.
All right, what is serviceable on these units? I mean, is everything? Yeah, you turn over a hot tub, they're buried in foam. All the lines are buried in foam because you're holding the temperature in there. So when we're looking at cold plunge tanks, are we doing the same? How can we service this? How can we get to the lines? Because there's going to be biofilm in there.
Yep.
All right. And this is going to be a very hot topic over the next couple of years. I'm part of a study that's going on right now on hot tubs here in the United States, and it's going to be very controversial when it comes out. Cold plunges are going to be the exact same way. So how is the tank designed for service? How are you going to limit the amount of organic material going in there, which is perspiration coming off the users? Are you going to use chlorine to oxidize it? Or are you going to oxidize it heavily at the end of the day and then exhaust that with an industrial exhaust fan when nobody's around? Are you going to put UV? Are you going to put ozone on there? And so you have to think, what is the germ going to do? And then how do you stop the germ from doing it?
Right.
So if we turn it around the other way, then you're practicing preventative treatment as opposed to remedial treatment.
Which is
That's,
always so much
that
better.
is awesome, Roy. I
Great
love it.
analogy. Great analogy.
Great analogy. That's
Yeah,
I
for
gotta
sure.
say I didn't get a chance to say at the beginning. What I really appreciate about you, and I've heard you speak many, many times, is you take very difficult mentality because you're a microbiologist and all those things, you know a lot of technical terms, and you make it so the average person can understand. That is a gift. So thank you.
It is. Very cool.
Well, people ask me, it's like, what do you do? And if I don't want to talk to them, I just tell them that I study things that make buzzards puke. And that usually ends the conversation, and then they walk away, and then
So only the truly motivated people will ask more. That's for
yeah,
sure.
Yeah, yeah,
usually, yeah,
that's it.
yeah. Hmm.
Right on.
So how often do you frequent the float tank then, Roy? Because maybe do you have any funny stories about your own experience? Because I'm a swimmer myself, and I think when we're actively involved in the science or the technology that we work in, then it becomes much more personal to us,
Yeah.
which
Uh,
is great.
well, the first time I went to the float conference, and then I did a talk on the microbiology, and I did the risk assessment of it,
Yes.
and it turned out that I got it right. Thank God. And 500 people in the room, and I'd never floated before, and I'm talking to them about microbiology. Anyway, so the next year, I told the story about the second time that I ever floated, and it's like we're getting enough float centers. I'm in Atlanta now, so we're getting enough float centers around. But it's like Atlanta is kind of like the traffic in Toronto. You're either 15 minutes away from something or 4 hours away from something, and the difference is one wreck. Uh, but anyway, so the second time I floated, and it's a different experience, but you have to learn to relax and think. I got out of the float tank after a 60-minute float and got my shower and got cleaned up and got ready to crawl in the car and drive home. And I realized that I was so relaxed that I was not capable of driving on the highway to get home.
Yes.
And so it's like, oh, it's like, all right, I'm 20 minutes away on the highway. What am I going to do? Well, down here we have quick trips. So it's like, so I pull into a quick trip and I go, all right, let's get some health food. All right. So I get some health food, and we call that health food, a dark chocolate Milky Way with
Hmm.
extra sugar and all the caffeine that goes with the dark chocolate. And naturally, of course, I washed it down with the Dr. Pepper, which has even more caffeine and more sugar. And I waited about 5 minutes for all the caffeine and sugar to hit my bloodstream, and then I drove home on the highway, and I was perfectly awake, you know. But all my muscles were relaxed from the float tank, but my blood pressure was way up from the caffeine and the sugar. But I was, relaxed, and so literally, a float tank can do that to you. You can be so, and the term that I hear them use, floaty.
Right. You're
When you get
floaty.
out, you're floaty, and it's like you're just kind of like, oh, okay. I guess the
Yes.
building's on fire. I should probably get up and leave
Move.
now. Okay.
That's the
Well, I might get another
relaxation.
cup of coffee before I go. It'll be fine. It's only a small fire. It's on the back end. I mean, so you can get really relaxed.
Chill. Chill, they say.
Yeah.
Chill.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very
It's a
cool. Wow.
natural
I
joy.
have to try it. I have to try it. I haven't tried it yet. I'm,
Oh,
I'm
you
very
got to
excited
try
to
it,
try it
Elsa.
now,
Well,
Roy.
and literally, I told that story at the float conference. With 400 people sitting there, and they're all laughing at me. Because they all knew it was true. And it's like,
Yes.
and it's a different experience.
Right.
It's a different environment. It's a different clientele that we normally see in our large aquatic venues. But
Cool.
our local float center here has an anniversary tomorrow. It's about 20 minutes away from me, so we're going down there to see them tomorrow. Down there,
Nice.
and so
I know.
it's a different environment.
And on the other end, so that's awesome. Like, I love the story. Cautionary tales, things, real quick and dirty, what things people should be aware of. We've talked about several, I guess. But
I think I'll tell a story on swimming pools. and then I'll tell the story on float tanks. When you walk in, if you're traveling on the road, and you walk into the hotel, and you're checking in at the hotel, if you can smell the swimming pool at the front desk of the hotel, and you want to relax that night, given a choice between going to the bar and going to the swimming pool, always go to the bar. Because if you can smell the pool at the front desk of the hotel, you don't want to even go into the room.
Agreed.
Okay, now we're going to tell the exact same story about a float tank. If you walk in to a float tank or a cold plunge tank and it smells off, and you've got a decent nose, go back to that QT or whatever, and get that dark chocolate Milky Way and that Dr. Pepper and relax with that. But it's like, use your senses.
Right.
Because I have walked into some venues where I could smell the mold. Wow. And that means there's something growing in the filtration system.
Right.
And so we have to use common sense. Yeah. And if our body is telling us something is wrong, we should probably listen to it.
Like that.
I think that's great advice, Scott?
Excellent. Yeah. And so I'm just going, sorry, I keep question. Do you float when you travel, Roy? I know you travel fairly extensively. So.
No, it's usually anymore my trips are, it's just like catch the trip out, get into the hotel, do 2 hours of work, jump on Zoom, go to the meeting, do whatever I've got to do, catch that trip home and try to avoid red eyes on the flight home. So it's like I'm trying to limit my number of days on the road, and perhaps I should be relaxing more on the road, but I'm trying to relax more at home instead of on the road these days.
That's smart too. And I guess you've got a comfortable place that you can visit locally that you trust and that it's great. So that, that's also true, right? You find an aquatic space or a pool or whether that they do an outstanding job and you feel that it's safe, that it's comfortable and you can go there.
Yeah, that's the secret. It's like you need to trust your senses and go with your senses, and that allows you to relax more easily.
Yeah, I believe that for sure. I can't believe we've almost spent an hour chatting, Roy, but I want to maybe just open it up to any other final advice or thoughts or exciting ideas. I know you're working on some interesting things. It sounds like a controversial paper coming our way from the world of hot tubs, so that'll be excited to look forward to that one. Anything else you want to share with our audience before we sign off?
Well, it's like in my consulting business, I've been allowed to go back and look into some of the historical pool literature. And what you're going to see over the next 2 or 3 years is considerable reviews of historical data that has not been really released before.
Right.
The impact of cyanuric acid on disinfection. 2 of the largest studies that have ever been done are sitting on my desk right now, and they'll be coming out in the next 6 months.
That'll be very valuable.
And so it debunks a large quantity of some of the material that's been pushed for the last few years.
Yeah.
The other topic I'm working on is a general review of how we got where we are with chlorine disinfection.
Right.
There's an awful lot of historical studies that have been lost.
Yeah.
And I'm working on that study in there. And it's really, I think in the beginning in the mid 90s, maybe slightly before that, we lost a lot of the historical data. And if you look at the right behind me, that's where a lot of the historical data is right now. It's sitting on my bookshelves right behind me because I've been collecting it for about 5 years now.
Yes.
And we're in the process of getting that information out. Some of it's going into the PHTA, some of it's in the CPO book. It'll be coming out in the CPO book. It will be
That's great.
generally available.
Yeah.
And it's amazing materials, it's amazing stories that we've just buried.
Yeah. I know an example that comes to mind as I think about Professor Morris, who did a lot of work on chlorine speciation, which is brilliant. And in fact, we've embedded his work into our digital application that helps people to understand it's not just about the ppm of the chlorine, it's very much about the pH and actually how much of the chlorine is doing any disinfecting at all. Which is, part of the broader context of more isn't necessarily better. It's getting the right amount at the right pH, right? So that, but that's one of the people that I think about because he wrote, some pretty interesting things, not just about pools in general, but about disinfection in general. That is old, but not known and not used. And
Very much so, yeah.
So I'm excited to hear more. That's really interesting for
What's
sure.
old is new again. Isn't that a thing? Isn't that a thing? So
Wisdom. There's wisdom in the past
there
for
is
sure.
wisdom in the learning from the past, and
For
I
sure.
I think as we draw to a close, what a wonderful discussion we've had, and thinking about where we've come, where we are, and the changes in our aquatic world, and I'll use float tanks as part of our aquatic world, and the growth of that industry and how it changes, and dealing with it on a microbiological and a health perspective and a wellness perspective, and then where's the future. And I'm so glad that you still research and that there's other folks in our business that are researching, pushing that boundary to make us safer. And for those of you us who have real passion for this industry, hopefully we can use that to let more people know. So Dr. Vore, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope we can see you again.
I'm around.
Thanks, Roy. It was wonderful. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks, Scott. It was a great discussion. And thank you to our audience for joining us in this fascinating conversation. You can listen to this episode and many others by subscribing to our YouTube channel or connecting with us on Apple Podcast or Spotify. If you have questions about this or future episodes or topics, please email us at mywatertalks@sanecotech.com from Scott and myself, and also from Dr. Vore. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.